Saul Landau, our guest. He's made over 40 films on many issues, most of them focusing on human rights around the world. How did this one compare with some of your others?
This film was really difficult. First of all, it's very hard to get financing. People hear the word Cuba and they don't want to give money in the United States. It was also difficult to get access to all the actors that we have in the film, like Fidel Castro and some of the people in Miami who have, well, now boast about their terrorist actions, and former FBI officials. So it took us time to get all this, and then it took me time to, I don't know, forge the arc of the film, to figure out how to put all this history together so everybody would understand the context for the case of the Cuban Five, that is all the past violence.
Sure. Well, one of the people in the film said, before my time, don't have any idea what happened in Cuba. I mean, it is the last Cold War conflict, true, I think.
It is, and it's a conflict, and it's not really about ideology anymore. It's just about disobedience, I think. Fidel is really in the Guinness Book of Records for disobedience.
Yes.
He's got 50-something years of it. And now, if you look around Latin America, his ideological children are heads of state in Venezuela, in Nicaragua, in Bolivia, in Peru now, or some of his cousins like Lula in Brazil or Dilma. He's changed the world.
But this film shatters any romantic notions any one of us has about revolution, what it's really about. And I guess we feel so naive, like, what do you know? Is this true, not true? We saw all the sides in the film, and part of you wants to say, but our government, or the US government, the Canadian government, they're pure as the wind driven snow. They have to be. One
would like to hope so, but unfortunately, the United States has not behaved well toward Cuba. It's behaved foolishly. You know, the obsession, as I said, that Fidel sort of planted in his enemies prevents them from thinking clearly. If the United States really wanted to change Cuba, it could do so in one day. Lift the embargo. Everything would change in Cuba overnight. But it doesn't do that.
Why?
Well, you know, somebody said, and I think it's accurate, that there's one group that doesn't have a lobby in the United States, and that's the American people. Everybody else has a lobby, and the anti-Castro lobby is very strong and very intimidating, and they win the day, along with a variety of other small special interests that have an interest in maintaining this foolish embargo. The whole world is against it.
But driven by the anti-Castro forces, driven by the Tea Party, who?
Well, I don't think it's the Tea Party. You see in the film a member of Congress in her congressional office, now a very powerful person, she's the head of the Foreign Affairs Committee, call for the assassination of Fidel Castro. This is nuttiness.
Yes, and well, U.S.-sponsored terrorism backed by the CIA to kill Castro has been around since the revolution, has it not?
Yes, it has. And so, you know, who comes out smelling good and who comes out smelling bad out of this? Here's the most powerful country in the world, essentially obsessed with violence against a relatively small, strategically unimportant country that has been disobedient.
Yes, but going back to the days when the Russians were putting a few missiles on Cuba, as closest the USA has probably come to war since the Second World War.
Yes, the missile crisis. And I think we explain in the film that a secret diplomacy, and I think this was new to many people, that Fidel Castro sent Che Guevara to Uruguay to offer a peace plan to the United States, offering to limit his military association with the Soviets, stop exporting revolution, and pay off the US companies he had nationalized. And the Kennedy answer was, sounds like weakness, turn up the heat.
And Kennedy and Khrushchev eventually got together, I assume, and decided diplomacy over war.
Yes,
I'm not quite sure. I wasn't in the Oval Office, but...
Yes, luckily, Kennedy turned out to be more of a peacenik than many people had imagined, and both withdrew. So the Soviets pulled the missiles out of Cuba, the United States pulled their missiles out of Turkey, and agreed not to invade Cuba.
What's the mood of the U.S. public about the Cuban Five? If you have anti-terrorist fighters, you call anti-terrorist fighters, unfairly imprisoned in U.S. jails, who's fighting for them?
Well, right now, the American public is by and large uninformed and therefore doesn't know who these people are. The few media stories that have broken have not been terribly informative. And we're hoping that this film will help people get a little bit better educated on this subject.
What was it like for you to visit one of the Cuban five in prison? Gerardo?
Gerardo,
yes.
Hernandez.
Spanish.
Yes.
Gerardo Hernandez.
Well, I went I visited him 6 times, 3 with Danny Glover. And on our first visit with Danny, it's quite a trek to get to the prison. It's in the Mojave Desert in California. And after going inside and meeting Gerardo, Danny said, this guy is the only person I've ever met who reminds me of Nelson Mandela. He's got an incredibly rich inner life and spirit that maintains him. And when he came out of this ridiculous prison, maximum security prison, he actually cried. And it was a moving experience. And it is every time. His spirit's higher than mine.
How did you get interested in Latin America, your first film on Fidel? How did the journey begin for you?
I was a student in 1960 when I made my first visit to Cuba, where I saw kids my age running government ministries. And I learned 2 things. One, that I didn't need to sleep as much. These people were sleeping 3-4 hours a night. I remember we had a meeting with Che Guevara in his office at the central bank. Yes, a group of students.
Yes.
And I think he set the meeting for 2:30 or 3:30 a.m. And he said, I'll give you 40 minutes because I have work to do.
At 3:30 in the morning.
And we asked him, well, when do you sleep? He says, well, when I can. I catch a couple hours here and there. And he said, sleep's overrated. You got plenty of time when you die. And he essentially was like most of the people at that time. He was about 7 years older than the rest of us. But people way younger were running government ministries. And I also learned that I was using much less of my brain than the people around me. I mean, here are these young people, and they're engaged. Their brains are really operating.
Right.
So this was my first contact. I went back to Cuba in 1967 for public television, U.S., and made a film called Report from Cuba. And the next year, Fidel liked the film. We sent him a copy, and he said, what's your next film? That was the first time I met him. And I said, we'd like to do one on you. And he said, oh, well, shucks, all right. And after waiting 7 weeks, at 3 o'clock in the morning, a phone call came, get all your stuff and crew downstairs. And we started our journey a week in a Jeep with him throughout the Cuban mountains in the eastern part of the island, where he plays baseball and visits his hometown and visits his nursery school, lights up a big cigar, and remembers poems that he learned when he was 4 years old, and meets people on the road and has wild conversations. So it was quite an experience. I have to confess that 2 days later, after spending the week with him, I couldn't speak.
I'm sure. I think it was President Reagan who said, this skirmish is not about the Cuban people. It's not the Cuban people we don't like.
It's Fidel Castro and communism. That's exactly what Reagan said, after Fidel had provided information to save Reagan's life, which was ironic.
How so?
Well, I don't know where they got the information from, but Cuban intelligence people found out there was a plot against Ronald Reagan. This is in the film. And they informed the U.S. Secret Service. And the Secret Service then sent very gracious thank you to the Cuban government. But as one of the Cuban diplomats said, but it was business as usual.
What we don't know, perhaps you'll have to do another book of poems. My Dad Was Not Hamlet.
Yes.
That was your book of poems.
Yes.
What is next for you?
Well, right now I'm looking forward to about a week vacation.
I understand. Has anybody tried to snuff this film or?
No, other films have.
Because it was shown in Cuba, right?
It's been shown on Cuban television. And apparently they're showing it in high schools now because the Cuban kids don't know their history any more than the American kids do.
Right.
But there were several bombings when the film Fidel came out. Opened at the almost opened at the Fifth Avenue Cinema, except for the little bombs that they put in the theater. And then we're going to open it in Los Angeles, and they burned the theater down. And the Center for Cuban Studies was going to show it in New York City. Luckily, the director went to the bathroom when the bomb exploded.
Luckily.
Yeah, and I've received a death threat or two in my time.
I'm sure you have. And you use a great cinematographer, Academy Award-winning cinematographer, did for this, Haskell Wexler.
Yes, Haskell and I made a whole bunch of films together. We made some films in Chile. We made films in Nicaragua. We made films in Jamaica and throughout the United States. So we've had a great association. And Haskell at age 90 is still doing terrific filming.
And won an Emmy or two along the way. Thank you.
Thank you, Fanny. Nice to see you.
Nice to meet you. Nice to see you. Saul Landau, will the real terrorist please stand up?